Well, I hope this is working. I think we are live. YouTube would not let me log on, so it just had the little the little cursor spinning, and it wouldn't let me start the stream. So I had to spend about 10 minutes waiting for it to pop on. My guess is everyone in the country is trying to do the same thing I had, trying to get on YouTube. So I'm sorry this didn't work as fast as I wanted, but we are up now. And if everyone can hear me, let's go ahead then and get started. A couple announcements. So I am going to assign this. So I do want you to take notes on this. I want you to, or take a picture of your notes or some kind of acknowledgement. And also, please comment on this if it isn't coming through right, or you can't see it, or I'm going too fast, or the screens aren't big enough. I don't know if it's working unless you let me know. In fact, I appreciate the comments, even if it's just, we can hear you and you were audible, just so I know that it's working. And so I'm including this. There will have to be a test. It's going to be after spring break, but there'll be a test over this, and I'm going to make you know Keynesian economics at the end. That will be on the test. I'm also going to assign Chapter 35. That is the only assignment you're going to have over spring break. Normally we would do more, but everything now is curtailed because of this. So yeah, it's a little bit of work, but not as much as normal. There is going to be one more thing. Sometime over spring break, I am going to put out the review packet that we have to do. I am narrowing it down. I'm waiting to see what the College Board is going to do for the AP exam. So as soon as I find that out, I'll let you know. By the way, the extra credit on the Road to Rock Bottom, I will get that into the grade book. I have almost all of it graded. It's starting to get a little bit less glitchy, and maybe I'm just getting more used to it. But remember, yesterday I went through all the enemies like Huey Long, not really enemies, but Huey Long and Dr. Townsend and communists did not like Roosevelt, did not think he was going far enough, which remember all the opponents, the conservatives, called FDR a communist, and the communists hated Roosevelt because he was saving capitalism. And also went through the AAA, the other programs. I did get to public works programs. I will briefly today because I'm getting to the biggie today. And this is also an important day because we get to Keynesian economics. I should add something about the second New Deal. Roosevelt came out in that first New Deal that he was going to act. He was going to commit himself to do something about the Depression and do something different. The same old dogma was help the rich. Poor people can figure it out themselves. It's their fault they're poor. And that same old thing was not working. And I'm mentioning that because that's exactly what's happening now. We have what looks like it could be a terrible economic depression with 3.3 million people now asking for unemployment insurance. I mean, this is a potentially a catastrophe economically, and the response from the House and the Senate, and will be signed by President Trump, this is what President Trump for the most part wanted, will be the same old thing. We have terrible economic problem, let's pump money into the corporations. It will work out to be about $4.5 trillion will be pumped to corporations, and that's part of the reason why the stock market, at least not today, but for the past 3 days, went up, because the big speculators realize, hey, they're bailing us out. For working people, not much, and for small business, it's not going to help much. Remember, this is a very conservative time, and a conservative time, it's going to help the very wealthy. And I do have one person saying no video. It should be on YouTube. Are you on YouTube? Did you go to my link and go to... Okay, I'm going to get off the screen. Well, let me go see if it is on YouTube. Okay, it says it is screening there, and I'm checking to make sure that it's coming up.
Are you on YouTube?
It has me a second late, but it seems like it is using it. It should be on YouTube. And let me try one more quick thing. You get a watch. If not, hopefully you have sound, but let's go ahead then and make sure that if you check my connection and gone to the YouTube station, let me put it in there one more time. I'm going to put it in every classroom, that YouTube section in multiple classrooms, so it will be on my message board in Google Teams. I will try to reload one more time. It is creative. Is anyone else not seeing? If you try to reload the screen, hopefully it'll work. That seemed to work for Jesse. Is anyone else? Is it working for? Kevin, I see you can't see it either. Do you have something? Because it seems to me that it is working. I get it. And as long as I can see myself, that is a small victory. So it appears to be working right. If not, try to reload it, or maybe get off your browser and go back again. Let's go ahead then and get started. Okay, so we got the second New Deal, and the big thing this was to try something else. The first programs ended the free fall, but it was not the drastic measures needed. Now, this wouldn't be quite drastic enough. As it turned out, it wasn't quite big enough. The economy began to grow, as you see from that graph on the left, and unemployment began to drop. The GDP did go up. Let me move my face so I'm not blocking that. You see a big increase in the GDP right here. We'll talk about the Roosevelt recession a little bit later. And so let's get to the second New Deal. And this is probably the meat, the bulk of the New Deal. In fact, when people think of the New Deal and the long-lasting impact, GlassSteagall, as important it was, people didn't think about that as much as, I'm making myself smaller, which might be the benefit. All of you get to see me move around. So let's get to the four big parts of the second New Deal that will have impact to this very day. Both very positive impact, you could argue, but also impact on the way people felt about the United States. You could argue that these parts of the New Deal gave what we would call, after World War II, the American dream. A middle-class life where people could afford that car, that home, the occasional vacation, a refrigerator, those things that were seen as luxuries or upper-class life. And this is what people still expect, even though what created this, it's going to be called the Great Depression, does no longer exist. So let's get to this. First off, Social Security. And this was pushed, remember, Dr. Francis Townsend, those Townsend plans. This was an old age pension. There was virtually no pension. This would create it out significantly smaller, about 15% or 20%, not even 15% of what Dr. Townsend wanted. And it is not meant to be a full pension for someone to retire on and not have to worry about other money. This was going to be part of part of your retirement. Social Security, which would be what we call social insurance, where all society together creates an insurance package for all workers. All workers. You have to work to get this. But it's going to be part of a retirement. You will get this insurance on top of, I'm checking to see if there's any other messages. But this insurance on top of whatever savings you have, and then maybe a pension from your job. And now most workers do not have pensions. They have savings, and that's it. And you might have heard of a 401k. That is a way to save money for your retirement. And it's a pretty shaky way to do it. And if you don't believe me, just imagine if you had a big savings and it was all invested in the stock market last week, how your retirement might change dramatically. But let's get back to this. All workers. And the success of this is hard to even measure. But The big thing is Roosevelt sold it that all workers, regardless of your income, and therefore even the most wealthy people will get a Social Security benefit. Now, it will be capped at a relatively small level, and so it would be it's only a small part of your former income, and so for the very rich, they get a tiny check. But the thing is, once everybody gets this and relies upon it, it's almost impossible to get rid of. And that was his plan. If all workers get it, no politician would ever have the guts to get rid of this. In the United States, most programs are means tested. And so if they're designed to help working class people, they are capped at a certain income. So if you make over that, you no longer get the program. And that makes it pretty or easier to cut, because this is a social Darwinistic country. And it becomes easier to cut programs like, let's say, something created in the 1960s called Medicaid, which is health insurance for people with low income or no income. During the Trump administration, they have put big limits, work requirements and other limits on it to make it more difficult to get. And it's easier to do. If all people have it, like Social Security or something in the 60s, old age or healthcare for the elderly, like Medicare, it's much more difficult to cut. But all workers. And it will be paid by all workers through it also included, I almost forgot, unemployment insurance. And unemployment insurance, this would be collected by a tax per worker's insurance, a tax for each worker through their employer. And this only deals with layoffs. And so if you're laid off from your job, you can get unemployment insurance. If you just quit, you cannot get unemployment insurance, only if you're laid off. And that was a big part. That was more of a liberal element of this last bill. It had expanded unemployment benefits, because this only works for people who are employed. Self-employed workers technically do not get this, especially people who make their living off like driving Uber or things like that today. So this was all a massive part of Roosevelt's effort to get wages up. If workers know they have that little bit of old age pension, they can bargain for higher wages. And the big thing about this social insurance is this is all of us together. Workers alone have barely enough money to survive. So this, we will tax all workers and we'll pay for it through what's called a payroll tax. And then it was a 1.5%, went up to 3%. Now it is 6.2% paid by the employer and 6.2% paid by the employee. So a 12.4% tax on payrolls. And so workers today are funding funding retirees today. So when I retire, your work will help fund my retirement, and so on and so on. And that's the essence of insurance. It's like health insurance. Healthy people today, either through their jobs or they pay it on their own. Healthy people are funding people who are sick, and then when you're sick, healthy people will fund you. Same thing with car insurance. All people who have car insurance, they pay into a fund, and that will be used for people when they have an accident. And so that is the essence of insurance. So this is insurance. We all pay, we all get it. And this is the deal. And with that, it cannot go to the deficit. It cannot increase deficit spending. And so if there's not enough collected in the payroll tax, the actual benefits will drop a little bit. And any surplus, most of your life, there's been a surplus. They actually invested. Of course, they invested in the most stable investment in the world, U.S. Treasury bills. This might shock a lot of you, but almost a third of the U.S. federal debt, so all the accumulated money that the federal government owes, is actually owed to other parts of the federal government. Most of that money is actually, or almost a third of that, is owed to Social Security. And so Social Security invested in the U.S. government. It's an accounting trick. But that's how it works. And this is a very liberal program. This is the essence of liberal economics, Social Security. Or another way you can say that this is progressive. And so this is a democratic liberal program. And I'm always in awe politically that Democrats don't do this enough. For years, Democrats would bring out FDR, New Deal, Social Security. Politically, they've become much more conservative, and only a few do it. Conservative Democrats and Republicans then hated it. Now, basically, the whole Republican Party, at least their hierarchy, hates it. Now, rank and file Republicans love it because they need this to retire on, and the older people are, the more likely to be Republican. But the leadership hates this. And they hate it for a couple different reasons. First off, this can raise wages. Remember, wages, they want to go down with trickle-down economics. This raises wages because it gives workers more bargaining power. They can say, I don't need to work my last 3 years because I know I have Social Security. I have other options. I don't need this job. This is a big deal towards raising wages. And it also could allow workers to potentially retire a little bit earlier, which decreases the amount of people in the workforce, aka drops wages. But there's another thing. Conservatives hate this because it goes against social Darwinism. According to social Darwinism, if you're rich or you have saved a lot for retirement, good for you. If you haven't, that's your fault, and starve. And I wish it was more different than that, but that is the essence. In fact, that's what people said. You're basically giving away money, which you're not. I am paying taxes into Social Security. In fact, I should add that this is probably the biggest tax that most workers pay. Most workers don't pay a lot in federal income tax, but they all pay that 6.2% of their income. All of it goes to Social Security. And if you're self-employed, that's 12.4%. In fact, if you do have a job and get a W-2 and you look at it and there's FICA, that's Social Security tax, and it's a big tax. In fact, one of the biggest tax increases in history was during the Reagan administration that doubled FICA. And I should add, it's not going broke. People say it's going broke, we have to cut Social Security. No, the people who say it's going broke are conservatives and do not like Social Security. It can't go broke unless people quit working, which I know right now it makes me a little scared. Now, benefits might be cut a little bit because they can't do any deficit spending. But it's not going broke. But there are some problems. And let's get back to the payroll tax. The payroll tax is regressive. All workers pay 6.2% today until they reach about $140,000. All income over $140,000 is not taxed under Social Security. That means if you make $1 million a year, the 6.2% tax only applies to that first $140,000. For the next $860,000, no tax, zero tax. So for someone making $1 million a year, your effective tax rate is about 1%. And if you're making $10 or $20 or $30 million a year, your effective Social Security tax goes down to virtually nothing. So this only taxes working people. The thought was this would get most income. That's what they thought. About 90% of income would be taxed. But the gap between the rich and the poor has grown so fast in the last 20 years, it's growing exponentially now. And just wait till after this crash. The richest people are not paying the Social Security tax. And the tax doesn't apply to speculation. So income that comes from the stock market or real estate gambles. And so they're not collecting as much money. Now, there's a couple ways to get around that very easily. You have the tax go to all income, or you have the tax go to speculation earnings called capital gains. But they're not willing to do this. Most Republicans are very conservative, and there's enough Democratic conservatives that will cut benefits for working people despite the fact they paid into it. I should add that President Trump did say 2 months ago that he said that it would be very easy to cut Social Security. So that's a cutting for most workers. And President Obama wanted to cut it in 2014 or 2012 and 2014. And it was stopped probably by efforts by Senator Sanders. And so that's Social Security. But I should add, this is the most successful program in American history. People love Social Security. It is incredibly efficient. Every month people get a check. And the poverty rate was over 80% for retired people in 1935. Today, it is around 10 to 15%, but it's going up because fewer people have savings. So that's Social Security. Next, the Wagner Act. And the Wagner Act, another element of liberal economics, but this would allow for unions to collectively bargain. The NRA implied it, but now the Wagner Act would say unions can collectively bargain. And if workers at a company, the majority of them, in fact, the law says 1/50%, that's the way the law is written. If they vote for a union, then that company must recognize the union. And at least for the first 12 years of the law, once they're in a union, all workers must support the union. But a collective bargaining agreement virtually all the time will give higher wages and benefits to workers. And I'm a member of a union. I've most certainly benefited from the union, so I am biased towards that. I know how teachers in other states who don't have unions and how much more difficult it is, so I am biased towards labor unions. And unions are pretty weak today, but I know my life is significantly better because of this. And it also set up the National Labor Relations Board. This is actually the National Labor Relations Act, but everybody calls it under the man who sponsored it, Robert Wagner of New York, Bob Wagner. So the National Labor Relations Board then would be a regulatory board that workers could make complaints to if companies try to stop labor unions, like fired a worker who wanted to start a union or actively campaigned against unions. But like any regulatory board, it only is as strong as the people in it. And if the president is pro-union, they'll put pro-union people on it, and they'll aggressively force companies to recognize unions. If, like today, the president is anti-union, they will do virtually nothing. And that is the way it has been since 1980s. And union membership has dropped dramatically, but not then. For FDR, this was good politics. Labor unions exploded, and you can see from that sign, if that is not an FDR poster from Franklin Roosevelt's campaign. That is from a union called the Congress of Industrial Organizations, and they are going to vote for Roosevelt. Roosevelt gave them unions. Unions got higher wages and worker protection and safety, and therefore they remembered who they voted for, and they voted for Democrats. And I'm checking it now. Okay, no questions. Okay. Remember, if you have a comment or want me to slow down, please ask. Go on the Google chat and ask. I'm checking to make sure it seems to be working. And once again, also, if it's not working for somebody, let me know. But they voted Democratic, and this would be a major part of the Democratic coalition to the early 1970s. It would break down over Vietnam and civil rights. We'll get to that. Also, there we go. It raised all wages, and that was part of Roosevelt's plan. And wages also includes benefits, and our very weird Rube Goldberg system that would eventually include health care too. But it raised benefits for things like a full weekend. Crazy, huh? I mean, unions got weekends. And they would help push Roosevelt to do like overtime pay and things like that, but also, vacations and sick leave. And, it's unions that say, hey, you have to have a lunch break and you have to have a bathroom break. And you might say, well, wait a sec, I work at a job that's not union and we have those things. Yeah, that's why. Unions had political power and they pushed governments to do that. And Montana was used to be a very union and economically liberal state. And that's why it has very strong worker protections. That if you go to a different state, those don't exist. You go to Alabama, you don't see that. And it's kind of an interesting thing that Montana is now very conservative for the most part, but most of those worker protections have survived despite Republicans in the state legislature trying to get rid of them. But they raise all benefits. Here's another thing. They raise benefits for workers who aren't even in the union. Now that might seem counterintuitive, except for one simple thing. Companies don't want unions. They know workers altogether have real bargaining power. And so if companies don't want unions, yet unionism is strong in a country, they will raise wages and benefits and actually support laws that will raise wages to keep unions out. And so strong unions raise wages outside of companies with unions. For example, in Germany, most workers still aren't in a union, but unionism is so strong that they push all wages up. And at least if you compare wages per productivity, German wages are higher. Same with France. France has more unionism, but boy, no unions there. They protest. And so this is a graph that shows what happened after the Wagner Act. Membership in unions exploded. I'll do a little bit of unions. I'll do this the Monday after spring break. But by 1950, 36% to 39%, depending on how you measure it, of all workers are in a union. And this led to, until the 1980s, when unionism started dropping, wages remained high for workers and going up. I should add, today it's about 6% and dropping, and it's going to drop even more. And that means less wages and less bargaining power. Trust me, you know what I mean. If you have a job and you try to individually ask for a raise, it's really difficult to do. So that's the Wagner Act. Few laws will be despised more by conservatives than the Wagner Act. And here are unions striking, demanding recognition. This is 36, that's 38. There would be over 4,000 strikes in 1937 alone after this. And they would get unionism. And World War II exploded. So let's get to the Wealth Tax Act. I'm going to exit this because I want this to be no questions? Okay, good. I'm going to do something very quick. I'm going to type something in just to make sure my chat is working. Okay, so we're back. The Wealth Tax Act. Yep. All right, good. I just wanted to make sure that the chat is working. All right. So the Wealth Tax Act. This is another major part of the Second New Deal. And I put that picture of Huey Long and the Share the Wealth because Huey Long's Share the Wealth Act pushed Roosevelt, just as workers and unions pushed Roosevelt. You know, Roosevelt made it very clear for the Wagner Act. If you don't allow for unions, that will encourage communists. And that's what he said about Social Security. If you don't allow for Social Security, the Townsend Act will come and they want $200 a month, not $20 a month like Social Security would do. And the Wealth Tax Act, do you want share your wealth where all incomes over $1 million will be taxed to 100%? No. Now this is, they sometimes called it the soak the rich. And there's Huey Long and Roosevelt would go towards this. And so this would be a progressive income tax. And a progressive income tax means that the higher your income, the higher the tax. And I'll explain this more in a sec, but the highest marginal income tax rate then would be 79%. Oh, that's an interesting question. August asked about the New Deal, and the entire program is called the New Deal. So all of the acts lumped together are part of the New Deal. And I hope that answers your question. So each one is part of. And then the first New Deal, it's just simply a way they called the first acts, which were some important, but not as big as these laws. So, highest marginal income tax rate. That does not mean everybody paid 79%. I will show you the numbers. But it also had a progressive estate tax. So very large estates would be taxed. And this goes back to the founding fathers who are fearful of an inherited aristocracy who would inherit their wealth and run the country. And the thought was we must all move along according to our own merits. And there's reasons why they did this tax. I meant to put the progressive estate tax as a little bit over as part of the second tier. So the progressive income tax, why did they tax there? That's where the wealth is. The wealth is on top. The wealth is focused there. If you tax poor people, that will pull money out of demand. At the time of debt deflation, the very wealthy, if they save their money, they're hoarding the wealth. They're sitting on it because there's no reason to invest. So you tax where the money is. They're sitting on it. They're hoarding wealth. But also, remembering capitalism, one of the great elements of capitalism is those who invest in capital, they get the profit. And that is an incentive to create and innovate. But that's also could be a problem. If all the profits go on top, that means the money is there, and therefore you have to tax it, or the money will all focus on top. I should add, don't forget, monopolies. We have all the monopolies being created at this time. But the big thing is, high progressive income taxes raises wages for everybody on the bottom. Now, this might seem counterintuitive, but part of the reason conservatives oppose this so much because they knew a high progressive income tax is a wealth transference from money that was focused on top to working people. And it works in this basic element. With low income taxes on the very wealthy, so they can collect as much money as possible, this will encourage speculation because they will have this big pool of money they can play with. They can speculate, they can invest in real estate, or they can build gold-gilded toilet seats. They can do whatever they want with it. The process of building a gold-gilded toilet seat could be incredibly complex. But also yachts, you name it, you can build private jets. They can do all that because they know they have all this money. Now, sure, they can invest in production, but do they really have to? They have all this big pool of money. But really high income taxes on the very tip-top earners, on the wealthy, discourages that because they know if they pay themselves more money, it's taxed away. So this is the thing you have to get for this, and I don't think I typed this in, but I should have. Oh, I did. This will encourage investment in manufacturing. Big corporations will have less incentive to pay higher dividends or their CEOs more money because it will be taxed away. So they want to invest in manufacturing. Another way to look at it is they can invest in research and development. They can invest in higher productivity, better products, which means higher wages. This encourages investment in manufacturing. Low income taxes on the very top encourages speculation. Every single time there's been a big tax decrease for the wealthy. So the wealthy got a big tax cut. And you saw this in 21 and 26. Will be an increase in speculation. 21 and 26, Florida and the stock market. In the 1980s, in the huge tax cuts under the Reagan administration, a huge stock market and real estate boom. In the early 2000s, you're going to have a massive, just unprecedented speculation in real estate and complex financial securities, which we're not going to get to here. An increase in taxes. That funnels money away from big paychecks and goes towards investment. That is why one of the biggest things that conservatives wanted when they got into power was saying that we could get more investment in companies if we cut taxes. So this has a big effect on having equality of wages. And so you can see it right here. The top tax rate at over 70% and over 90%, you notice in the 1950s. That's the top line right here. So you notice the big tax cuts of the 1920s. This right here is the percentage of income, not wealth, just income, going to the top 1%. Higher taxes, lower income for the 1%. Lower taxes like today, more income. Now it's over 35%. And I should have, because that ends in 2008. And I should add, where are we at here? I'm trying to look at this graph. That is just the marginal income tax rate. But you look at the way it was in the 1970s. only 9% of this income. That meant over 90% are going to go to all earners. And that means average workers are getting more money. That means they have more money to spend, more security. That was the goal of liberal economics. Now, this graph, I hope you can see it, but this shows all the tax rates of the 1936 bill, would take effect in 1938. And so it goes from a marginal income tax rate of 4% on the top all the way down to 79%. And I'm looking at that, and I am going to, once again, the creative process is going to happen here. We are going to copy this, and I'm going to make it bigger because I realize that's incredibly hard to see. I blame society. So let's do this first thing first. I'm going to crop this. So you can see the top, and I can make it bigger. I know, this is so exciting. I envy you. You get to watch this. And then I'll crop the other side. Yeah, I probably should have done this earlier, but it seemed to work okay when I first did it. So I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I enjoyed bringing that to you. Okay, so those are all the tax rates. Now, let's look at the tax rates more individually. It has all the way from 4% to 79%. I know you might think, oh my gosh, that's so complex. It's actually really easy. Back when I first started doing my taxes, and when all I had was an abacus and a rock, they had a book. They would sit down in the back of the little IRS book, and you just find your income, and it had it all figured out. This is actually relatively easy. Let me repeat. Doing the taxes is easy. Figuring out your income, that's the part where you have accountants. And that's where they have all kinds of loopholes to get people to reduce their income. Have you ever heard of a deduction? That is how you reduce your income. So let's get back to here. So it says the lowest marginal rate is 4% from $0 to $4,000 a year. And then it goes to 8% from $4,000 to $6,000. All the way to, you notice, 79% for income over $5 million. That only affected about 4 or 5% of all the income earners in the United States who were over $5 million a year at that time. So that's the way they did taxes then. But these are marginal. So once you figure out your income, if you make, let's say, $2,000 a year, which the vast majority of workers made less than $2,000 a year in 1938. They made less than $1,000 a year. You pay 4% of that. Let's say you make $2,000 a year, you pay 4%. Oh, what is that? $800. So that's what you pay in taxes. That's your taxes. Now, the marginal rates go like this. All income up to $4,000, you pay 4%. For income over $4,000 to $6,000, you pay 8%. So let's say you make $6,000, or let's say you make $5,000 a year. $5,000 a year. For that first 4%, you pay for that first $4,000, you pay 4%. That's it, 4%. And then, if you make $5,000 a year, that next $1,000 a year, you paid 8%. So for the first $4,000 income, for 4%. For the next $1,000, you pay 8%. Let's say you make $11,000 a year. So let's look at the rate. I'm pointing at it right now. So imagine my finger pointing at the first one. You make $11,000 a year. For the first $4,000 of your income, you pay 4%. For the next $2,000, you pay 8%. For the next $2,000, you pay 9%. For the next $2,000, you pay 10%. And for the next $1,000, you pay 11%. Now, I know that sounds complex, but they had a book. You just, boom, you figured it out. It's actually incredibly easy to figure out. It's really easy. Same thing today. Now it's all done in a computer. You put it in, boom, it's done. And so, let's say you make $6 million a year in 1938. You have all those steps, you pay different percentage of taxes, and then For $6 million, all income over $5 million, you pay at 79%. So for that $1 million over $5 million a year, you pay at 79%. And so everybody pays the same tax for the same dollar. Everybody pays 4% for the first $4,000. Everybody pays 8% for the next $2,000. Everybody pays 9% for the next $2,000, and so on. And so the whole idea is it would not discourage people to move up in income. If you move up in taxable income, you move from, let's say, $18,000 a year to $22,000 a year, you still pay the same tax for that first $18,000 a year, all those little marginal rates. And that's how taxes work. That is the way it's done today. And so the whole thing is designed, the tiny percentage you pay this, they would rather not pay taxes. That discourages them to speculate. And in 63, that's the way the taxes work. You'll notice it's 91%. 91% as the highest tax rate. And I should add, this is at the time of perhaps the best economic growth in American history. And in 1988, look at the extent of the tax cuts. Remember, it was 91% in 63. It would go down to 70, then 50, and then look at the highest marginal rate in 88, down to 28%. Now let's look at it today. 2019, it is 37% for income over $510,000. And that is how taxes work today. It is significantly more conservative and regressive today. And because of the way corporate taxes work, this is basically the top 1% pay right here. And most of those people, because of other taxes and various ways they can reduce their income, they pay either the same or slightly lower taxes than most working people. And that is the way taxes work today. So, that is the highest marginal income tax rates for the highest earners and lowest earners, you can see from that graph today. And let's get to the last biggie of the second New Deal, the Works Progress Administration. Now, the name, you might have heard the name infrastructure. That actually was a term that was not used yet. The name for infrastructure in the 19th century, remember the term internal improvements? Well, at this time, it was called public works. Public works. And public works were the government building dams, roads, bridges, what we would call infrastructure today. And there were a few relatively small public works programs before the WPA. The Public Works Administration, the PWA, the Civil Works Administration, the CWA, they were really pretty small. Also, the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, who did various things like parks and bridges. For those of you who took that freshman trip to Lewis and Clark Taverns and were walking on those in the tunnels that have nice little paths, that was done by the CCC. But anyways, let's get back to this. There were two relatively small programs that weren't big enough. Roosevelt decided that we need a massive program, the WPA. And this would be the biggest of all the programs. And so, let me make sure the sound is going okay. So, we're going to watch a little bit of that New York, Great Depression New York one we watched for the other programs, but this talks about the WPA. And let's hope this works. It does not. So much fun. Here we go.
The mayor could prod and cajole, but the power to create more sweeping social and economic changes lay in Washington.
So that's the Mayor LaGuardia of New York
After 2
City.
years of emergency measures, Roosevelt created the Works Progress Administration, and by presidential order forbade the agency to discriminate on any ground.
This is huge.
The WPA became the biggest alphabet agency, the biggest spender, the biggest employer of them all.
And had great songs. This is the biggest of all the programs. Look at all those people lined up to get this good job. And it did not discriminate. Get this down. Did not discriminate based upon race. This was revolutionary. The government was Jim Crow.
Under the WPA, so many people found jobs. And I think that we can never play down the importance of the WPA. Without it, there have been many who would have simply lost some of their skills and their talent. I like the idea that as we look at it today, so many programs that got started then through but WPA workers laid the foundation for a better future.
Well, after 6 years being out in the street, I guess, and working down on Wall Street, it's pretty good getting a job. My wife told me, where you going 12 o'clock? I said, I got to get on that line and get a ticket, and here I am. So if you see me, I'm not lying.
Get this.
WPA workers built 651,000 miles of public roads.
That's our highway system.
More than 125,000 buildings. More than 8,000 parks. The agency funded hot lunches for children of the poor.
Did you catch all that? Over 600,000 miles of roads, over 100,000 public buildings, including the courthouse here. Virtually all the dams across the United States are going to be WPA. Fort Peck, WPA. Canyon Ferry, WPA. Hauser, two of the four dams were Great Falls, WPA. The Grand Coulee Dam, the biggest dam in the United States, WPA. Hoover Dam, which and changed it to make sure that Hoover got credit, which started under Hoover but would be finished with the WPA. This is the biggest dam program ever done by the United States. This built almost all the bridges, our highway system be created. It's hard to imagine the size of this, but also it was the term would have been progressive or liberal. This fits in very much with liberal economics. It provided daycare for workers with children and also schooling for workers with children and flexible hours for workers with children. It also gave money for people who worked with the arts. It gave money for people who worked in music because, hey, in bad economic times, people aren't going to be going to plays. And so it funded, one of the best examples would be Orson Welles, the great director, would work for the WPA. And he would do plays. Some of the most famous ones would be Shakespearean plays with casts that were all African Americans, which was seen as scandalous. And later on, he would go on to do Citizen Kane to be one of the most famous directors in American history. WPA was incredible, and the art is great. I love all the posters with it. But did you catch all that? Over 600,000 miles of roads, buildings, dams, you name it. This built it. Now, please play.
Daycare for working mothers, and provided federal support for the arts, paying writers, musicians, actors, painters to perform, teach, and create art across America.
Should the Roosevelt administration man want to work, he began to get recognition of himself. He began to feel better inwardly. So he could walk up. He wasn't stooped. Before he stooped down, he walked around and he was really depressed. And Roosevelt gave this guy a new set of hopes, and that kind of changed the ball game a bit.
Now it's back to New York City here, but
New York City was receiving 1/7 of the WPA budget for the entire nation. Roosevelt said about LaGuardia,
the mayor of New York,
he comes to Washington and tells me a sad story. The tears run down his cheeks, and the first thing I know, he has wangled another $50 million out of me.
And we shall continue on our onward march.
That's LaGuardia.
To make this a better and a happier city.
The mayor and Robert Moses continued to modernize New York. The West Side Highway would make it possible to drive non-stop from one end of Manhattan to the other.
Still there.
LaGuardia Airport would become the busiest in the world.
And then they
200 flights a day.
They rebuilt in the 60s and it's awful.
Schools, parks, 10,000 new public housing units, all part of a massive building campaign, made New York a leader in the new federal partnership with America's cities. On July 11th, 1936, with Mayor LaGuardia and Robert Moses in attendance,
WPA bridge right there.
President Roosevelt dedicated the bridge that had brought pain and now pride to New York City.
This is called the Triborough Bridge that connected Bronx, Brooklyn, and Manhattan.
The Triborough Bridge.
Still there.
$60,300,000 highway link.
It's still pretty cool.
By President Roosevelt. Yes, people require and people are demanding up-to-date government in place of antiquated government, just as they're requiring and demanding Triborough bridges in the place of the ancient ferries. Government itself cannot close its eyes to the pollution of water, to the erosion of soil, to the slashing of forests, any more than it can close its eyes to the need for slum clearance and schools and bridges.
That's kind of laying out the liberal point of view.
The Bridge, in the years to come, justify our efforts and our hopes by truly serving the city, the state, and the nation.
And you notice him standing.
The things that he did, said to us, no matter who says that feeding the hungry or giving clothing or helping those who need housing to get housing, no matter who says that creates dependence, that the government has to take a hand.
He saved capitalism, whether this is a good thing or not. I'm not about to betray my sentiments. But
he's an author who hates capitalism.
It could very well have gone under, and those who said he's a traitor to his class didn't realize he was their savior.
It's true.
Remember, the people at that time were called downtrodden. They had no lead, they had no hope. So you had two new guys come into the picture, Roosevelt and LaGuardia. And they stayed with America for a long, long time. The image of Roosevelt and the image of LaGuardia.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Fiorello H. LaGuardia. Their partnership changed the face of New York and expanded the role of American government. A half-century later, the physical changes endure. The responsibilities of government are still debated.
And that is definitely not the way it is today. But that's a WPA. It's hard to describe what a big deal that was, what a building program it was. And as you can see from this, how the federal budget, you have a little bit down to right here, that's the WPA. By the way, I'll explain this, that's the Roosevelt recession. But look how industrial production went up all through it and it passed, after years of hell, past what it was in 1929, the beginning of the recession. And the same old documents, this didn't count WPA employment, which makes no sense. But you notice how unemployment went down. Now, it's still too high. But there is this feeling by 36 that Roosevelt has saved us. And the GDP is going up. I mean, it feels better, even though there's still significant suffering, especially on the cities, on the farms and small towns. But one of the big effects of the second New Deal especially, but also the first New Deal, would be what's called the Great Compression. And I can't begin to emphasize enough what a big deal this was. For the first time in history, over the long term, the gap between the rich and the poor shrunk. And it shrunk dramatically. And this created what we call today the middle class. And don't forget, the actual middle class are people who have to work but can afford some of the trappings of an upper class life. Well, there are more people than ever before after the New Deal and World War II that can afford the trappings of an upper class life. And this gave this idea that we're all this middle class society, that people still say it's that way today. Even though you can tell from this chart, this is the top 10, the income share of the top 10%. And look what it was. The top 10% had over 50% when the Great Depression began. And throughout the time of the best economic growth and also the highest tax rates, here's how low it was. I should add the bottom one, that's not counting wealth gain from like speculation in the stock market. This counts stock market and real estate. But you notice how what it is today, and oh, by the way, that little crash, that's the real estate boom, but now it's well over 50%. And this was part of Roosevelt's goal. If you're going to save capitalism, you need a large group of people with money that could spend in this new consumer economy. That's where you get this right here. That's the Great Compression. Let me show you another table. These are annual income changes and changes in real income. So both essentially say the same thing. They're just two different ways to measure it. And this is a little bit, this is to 2004, but it hasn't really changed a lot. But the green is the income change, almost 10% more for the lowest fifth of income earners, 9.5% for the fourth fifth. And the top 1%, their income still went up, just not as much as those on the bottom. That had never happened in history. You see the same thing in changes in real income in this other graph up to 2010. The blue, that's the Great Compression. And look at that. That's actually remarkable. This is the bad inflation, the green one, of the 1970s. The red here is up to 2004. But this line right here, what I'm circling here, that's 1979 to 2010. And there's virtually no change in real income for the bottom fifth. And most of the income growth has gone to the top. Today it's even more. In fact, arguably, in income, this is here, but in wealth, these two are negative, have negative wealth, more debt than wealth. And so that is the essence of, that was the years of liberal economics. Now, you could imagine how they chafed at this. Well, you have this kind of income growth. That gives workers here real bargaining power. You have this low income, workers can't really argue. They got to take whatever wages they can get. Oh, I'm blocking part of this. Let me move my face. Sorry. So, let me quick finish this up. The election of 1936 then would be an incredibly popular Roosevelt. And the Republicans are really, in 34 midterm elections, the Democrats did really well. So the election of 1936, conservatives rallied towards, well, and they put a lot of money, significantly more than what Roosevelt got, towards a conservative candidate. But they actually nominated a moderate, which meant he accepted some of the New Deal, the governor of Kansas, Alf Landon. And so there's Landon on the left. And Landon's basic campaign was, sure, the New Deal was fine in some ways, but not good enough. We can do better. In fact, you see that increased activity, price employment, that picture right here. What that is a picture of is trying to claim that, sure, there is increased activity, but it's the New Deal that's holding us back like an anchor, implying that's making the low wages, even though, but conservatives rallied to him with the assumption is once rational people realize how Roosevelt is far too radical in changing the economy, they'll go back to the way it was, and the economy's not that bad, it's okay. But the big thing is to, hidden in a whispering campaign, he's a communist. So, but Roosevelt had a big advantage. He was building a coalition of supporters. And this would rally to the Democratic coalition, and would be the Democratic coalition until the early 1970s, until a combination of events partially caused by conservative Democrats taking power would get rid of it. But labor unions, small farmers, urban voters, working class people, new immigrants, and an important shift, African Americans. African Americans had always voted Republican in areas they could vote. Remember, because of Jim Crow laws and things like the Grandfather's Clause, most black voters in the South could not vote. But those who got out could vote in the North. Yes, there's barriers, but could vote. But they generally, not a full majority, but 60-40 in most elections, voted Republican, partially because that was the party of Lincoln. And because Southern Democrats, because there's only the Democratic Party in the South, were so racist and Jim Crow law. But because of the WPA and ending discrimination and that feeling that Roosevelt's trying to help all workers regardless of race, African American voters started to vote for Democrats. And this would maintain 60-40, 70-30, sometimes even up to 80% of African Americans by 48. It would go down a little bit, but they started voting for the most part Democratic. Today it's well over 90%. And that reason is because of the Civil Rights era. In 64, when the Democratic Party became the party of civil rights, the Republican Party saw an opening. If they became the party against equal rights for all Americans, they could get those Southern Democrats that were Jim Crow into becoming Republicans. And electorally, it worked incredibly well for the Republicans. In fact, today the Republican Party is a Southern party because of their opposition to the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act. But that's another story. It's more complex than what I'm telling you. Because a lot of Republicans still voted for the Civil Rights Act. But within 2 decades, that Republican Party would become a party against equal rights. So, a couple different things. The Literary Digest did a telephone poll with a Gallup Corporation. Gallup still exists. And the Gallup Corporation, they did a poll, a telephone poll. And you can see it in the cover of their magazine where it says Landon leading. In fact, they thought Landon would win in a landslide. And our polling shows that the people want Landon and not Roosevelt. They're tired of the New Deal. Despite that Evening Times newspaper headline, marching on to defeat destruction of the New Deal, showing all workers and all people together to stop those trying to destroy the New Deal. And so the assumption was, yeah, God, Landon might win. But let me get back to this. But it's a telephone poll. A significant number of workers don't have telephones. This only polled the highest income people. It did not say the vast majority of workers, especially now with labor unions getting the workers out, it didn't count their vote. And we're jumping right to move. This. The election was a Democratic sweep. Roosevelt won almost all the states. Democrats took massive majorities in the House and the Senate, and they took almost all state governments. This was an incredible sweep. The Republican Party, people are saying, it's dead. It's gone. You can imagine how FDR felt. After this kind of victory, he could do no wrong. He has a mandate to do whatever he wants, aka hubris. This victory, ironically, would convince Roosevelt that he was invincible. But this is a massive Democratic victory. And Democrats would maintain majority in the House of Representatives all the way. All the way to the 1990s. That's how long the Roosevelt coalition lasted. And the Democrats, partially because of their own bad politics, would get rid of it, and they've never really got that back. But so Roosevelt would do a few things. I'm not going to get to Keynesianism. I'm sorry. I know you're not. And I know we've gone a little bit longer. Hey, this always takes longer than I think. But, called court packing. There was a very conservative Supreme Court. And two of Roosevelt's biggest New Deal laws, the AAA and the NRA, were found unconstitutional. This infuriated Roosevelt. Absolutely infuriated him. If they're unconstitutional, that means that Roosevelt, his other laws, okay, the NRA, Roosevelt decided it wasn't working anyways. But what about Social Security? What about the Wagner Act? The fear was that he is going to lose these laws. And that's one thing that faces today. You know, laws can be passed, but the Supreme Court, the way we do it today, the Supreme Court can throw laws out. And if you have a conservative Supreme Court, like today we have the most conservative Supreme Court since the 1890s, they could potentially throw out laws too. And that could be good or bad depending on your point of view. But Roosevelt's plan was, let's pack the court. It has been 9 for a while. Congress decides how many people are on the Supreme Court. Let's just put 6 more. In fact, the plan was they could add up to 6 judges for add up to 6 judges total. 1 judge for every judge over 70. The idea would be it'd be like a training program. And that's why this cartoon shows it as the 9 members of the Supreme Court. You can see them right there. Get my mouse over here. And then the 6 new judges would all be FDR. And the thought was, for Roosevelt, I can get liberal justices in. But his allies told him, you're going to look like a dictator, like you're going to get a rubber stamp court. This will not pass. You will lose some Democrats, and they will vote with all the Republicans, and it will not pass. But Roosevelt believed he could do no wrong. No wrong. And it failed. And this was a disaster for Roosevelt. A disaster. It proved that he could lose. He became invulnerable. Conservative Southern Democrats would join with Republicans, an alliance to stifle the New Deal. Arguably, and I did not type this in, but arguably, this ended the most radical parts of the New Deal. It ended it. I'll get to the last parts after I get to Keynesian economics, but this ended it because conservative Democrats knew now that Roosevelt was vulnerable. Before court packing, they were scared to oppose him because Roosevelt could do no wrong. Now, when I mean conservative economics. They believe in trickle-down economics. And one ironic thing would come out of this. He would be able to appoint a couple judges, by attrition. But also, they were cowed. And the Supreme Court would rule that, like, for example, the Wagner Act. There I am in the middle of Bob Wagner. I'm moving myself. The Wagner Act would be constitutional. Let me move myself over here. And I misspelled liberal. I'm going to change that. The Supreme Court became more liberal. Okay, that's pretty funny. What's a libers? There we go. The Supreme Court did become more liberal. But Roosevelt politically was hurt. In fact, Roosevelt would foolishly try to campaign against those conservative Democrats who opposed him, and he became even more unpopular after that. Hubris. Pure hubris. So Roosevelt, who did, I'm not saying the laws weren't mistakes, but seemed like he could do no wrong. And then one more big mistake, and the last thing for today. The 37-38 Roosevelt recession. Roosevelt had really thought, like a lot of people, maybe the Depression's over. As you can see from this diagram right here, unemployment had been going down. And the thought was, hey, we could probably cut back on some government programs. And that's unemployment going down. Now, you might see the problem here. Unemployment was still way too high. Now, this graph doesn't show it very well. If you count federal government employee workers, it was about 10%, so WPA workers. But, let me backtrack just a little bit. Let me go back to that. I know, I should have. Here. That's where unemployment was, right there, at 10%. The problem is you can see almost 5% of those workers are WPA employees. And so Roosevelt thought, okay, unemployment going down, wages begin to go up, we can cut spending. He was worried about the debt. Every year deficit spending was going up. In fact, with tax revenues down, government spending was continuing to increase. And worried about the debt, he decided, well, let's now balance the budget. And he asked Congress to cut spending. Now, he ironically allied himself with Republicans and conservative Democrats, now emboldened by court packing. His allies, the liberal Democrats, who wanted more government spending, and they wanted to expand the WPA, Roosevelt went against them, which angered them. Roosevelt made another tactical mistake, but they dramatically cut the WPA, which, boom, cut jobs. And remember, debt deflation. There's still that issue of everybody trying to pay back their debt. All of a sudden, you have a bunch of people not with jobs. They were fired by their WPA jobs. They were laid off. Demand dropped. Recession. And the recession, you can see this, another increase in unemployment. And the GDP dropped. This was a huge tactical mistake by Roosevelt. This recession. And you don't want recessions named after you. And they learned right away, oh no, it's because we cut spending. And that's why even today, conservative Republicans are putting a little bit of money into demand, the $1,200 check for some earners and increased unemployment benefits, because even though they don't like it, they know that if workers don't have money, demand drops and companies lose money. Profits dropped. So this recession, and that's when Roosevelt totally changed. Totally changed. The heck with the deficit. Deficit, schmeficit. Okay, I don't know if that's how you spell schmeficit, but it should be. Spend money. Heck with the deficit. We'll worry about it after it. And you can see by that chart that's somewhat hidden by my face. Unemployment began to drop dramatically, and then you're out spending for the war, which is government spending. The heck with the debt, we'll worry about it. He would adopt fully, finally, true liberal economics, finally in the terms of liberals who wanted this, called Keynesian economics. Keynesian economics. And right there, I'm going to quit. So I'll have to do Keynesian economics when we get back from spring break. Oh my goodness, spring break is coming. So, just to repeat, I know I went a little bit longer and I went, hey, this always takes longer. But that's part of the reason I want you to watch the video to see how people live. We talked about the policy that affects us today. I really wanted to get to how important this was today. The Great Compression is a big deal. And don't forget, I didn't mention this, but what's happening in the 1980s through today, and I think we're really going to see it with this bust now. They call it the Great Divergence. The Great Divergence. Let me move my face. We're in the Great Divergence now. And this latest bill through Congress is going to increase this even more dramatically. The wealth on top is going to, it's going to go up so fast. It's going to blow people away. I don't know what's going to happen with this. But remember the causes of Great Depression. This is a big shift that we've been in, and it's going to grow even more, but it's going to be more than the Gilded Age, much more. Now, you could argue for conservative economics, that's what they want. We'll see if that's a good thing, but boy, is it going to happen. And I really want to show that. So, you are responsible for this. I want to see some notes. And so you have to show me a picture. You can connect it to Microsoft Teams and assignments. I'll put this in an assignment or in chat, but you got to show that you watch this. And I'm going to do this for Keynesian economics too, and that'll be a good way, I guess, to start the break and then finish up the New Deal. So we're probably going to have some kind of test on this, probably the Wednesday after spring break. I know that's the way it worked, but I'm assigning chapter 35 over spring break. That's your only assignment. I'll put the review packet up there sometime with the directions over spring break. If there are no more questions, I am going to stop streaming. I covered a lot today, and this is a big moment. This has direct impact on us. And this would kind of become to personify what liberal economics and life when I was born. I do have a question. If you have it all today, in fact, yeah, let me see all today. I might pump a few extra credit points in there. But I have to see today's. If you have it for all what we did this week, I'll give you a little extra credit. Why not? I see no problem with that. And because I know there's been a few people been on the whole time. So show me just a few pictures. You can lay them all out. I'm not going to pick out that you got every detail, but I just want proof that you watch this. Not only because I think it's important to watch, but this is a lot of work. Hey, justify what I'm doing. All right. So if there's no more questions, I am stopping the stream. Goodbye. I will come on one time during spring break and just to give some messages. And if you have any questions, please ask. On that happy note,